And I think most folks know this, but so when our rebbetzin, my spouse Gina Fried, passed away in 2016, Shavuot fell on a Saturday night that year, and so the ritual committee decided that we would honor her memory by doing the Tikkun, and it was so lovely that we decided whenever it falls on a Saturday night, because we didn't feel like a weeknight we'd have enough critical mass, we would gather. So we've done it a few times since. It's been at least 4 years, I think. So I just want to dedicate our learning tonight, all of our learning tonight, to Gina's memory. And I'm going to be talking about my book. And Gina, I've been working on this for 10 years, so Gina saw the early phases of the book and commented on some of the first chapters, so I feel like she and her spirit is here. So yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit, read a little bit, we'll converse a little bit, and then I'll let you know what's happening for the rest of the evening. So yeah, so let us begin. So my book is called God is Here, Reimagining the Divine. Copies for sale outside. And I thought the name like God is Here is actually a really good name for Shavuot because this is the night that we're supposed to re-experience meeting God at Sinai. So here it is, God is here. We're at Sinai. Here we are with the divine. So I just very briefly, a number of you have studied this with me before, but just sort of how this book came to be. So really since rabbinical school, so over 30 years, I was very intrigued by Mordecai Kaplan and his attempt to create a way of thinking about God that would appeal to modern, rational, science-based people. You know, people that he saw around him in the 1930s and 40s, and certainly today, almost 100 years later. And while Kaplan wasn't a metaphysicist exactly, he talked about God not as person, but as power or process. Some of you might remember I was really into the notion of, that's being weird, notion of process thought for quite a while and process theology. And then one day I walked into a bookstore, Porter Square Books, worker-owned, shop there. And on the staff pick table was a book called I is an Other, or something like The Secret Life of Metaphor and How It Shapes the World, or something like that. And it was basically a summary for people like me who are not cognitive linguists of the work of cognitive linguists, and specifically George Lakoff and Mark Johnson and people in their field who make a sort of fairly simple but powerful argument that as human beings we cannot apprehend the world without metaphor. That the way our mind works, when it comes to really anything except our most basic physical existence, we are in metaphor. So when we say she's a very warm person, we don't mean like her skin feels hot, right? We mean she's emotionally warm, and that comes from being held as an infant by an adult. And actually neurons in the brain connect the part of the body, the part of the mind that registers physical warmth with the part of the mind that registers emotional connection. Or I'm feeling up today, up being associated with happiness, and down being associated with sadness, again, comes from basic physical things. So that's so great. And I knew a little bit about George Lakoff, so the God part wasn't there yet. And then Giri uses an analogy of volcanoes to talk about metaphors. So he says sort of like active metaphors, like an active volcano. And an active metaphor is one that, you're reading a poem and it says like the dark hug of time, and it's a metaphor. Like time doesn't really hug anybody. Then he's what he called dormant volcanoes or dormant metaphors, and those are metaphors that we use, but we know that there's figures of speech. I'm up a creek without a paddle. So that's like a dormant, well, again, you're not really in a creek holding a paddle, but in our culture, if you say that, people know what you mean. And then there's what Giri calls extinct metaphors. Lakoff and Johnson call metaphors we live by. And these are the metaphors, like I mentioned before, metaphors that we're in and that we have no idea we say them as if we're stating reality. A very basic one is I see what you mean, which is based, again, on infant experience. If you don't see it, it's not there. So seeing is knowing is the metaphor. And metaphors work this way. There's a target. The target is a concept, not a physical experience. So knowing, or love, or life, or ideas, or argument, or anger, things that are not reducible to physical experience. And to get to those targets, to understand them, to talk about them, even to experience them, we need metaphors, and metaphors are always embodied. So a metaphor is, a physical experience. So something in my brain went, aha, when he talked about an extinct metaphor, and I was like, that's it. God is an extinct metaphor. The last 2,000 years of arguing about God exists or doesn't exist, isn't really an argument about God at all. It's an argument about a metaphor, and the metaphor is God is a big person. Because the people who don't believe in God and the people who do believe in God, when they're talking about God, usually are implying that God is a big person. Because God knows and loves and judges and, all these words that we wouldn't use for a hurricane or a tree. So once I realized that, I was like, oh, so then the goal is not to find the way to think about God, not to find the definition of the divine. It's just to expand our metaphors. And then I started looking in our tradition, and we have so many metaphors in Judaism. The Hebrew Bible is chock full of them. So that really became the work, and that's what I spent the last 10 years doing, was researching them. And a lot of you all I know were in the classes, and I wanted to see if it worked. So we studied the metaphors, and then we tried to bring them into our lives, and it worked. It really profoundly helped people, I think, in relating to the sacred. So the book is, the first 2 chapters basically go into what I just said. And then the rest of the book is, if you haven't read it, each chapter is a different metaphor, mostly from the Hebrew Bible, from Tanakh, one from rabbinic literature, and one from the modern world. So there's water, place, voice, rock, cloud, fire, ahia, becoming, and then the 2 modern ones are GPS and electricity, which I actually talked about at Hi Holidays. Hey, folks. So I want to do a little reading, things that relate to Sinai and to Shavuot. But I want to say that I think when we enter the realm of metaphor, we're being invited into our ancestors' world. I was very influenced by a book by James Kugel, which is a really great name for a Jewish Bible scholar, Kugel. James Kugel, who has a wonderful book called The God of Old, and in it he tries to get at what was going on in the earliest strands of Tanakh, the earliest strands of Hebrew Bible. What was it trying to capture? And he basically said it's trying to capture an experience in words, and words are always limited. And for our most ancient ancestors, or the ones that we have a record of, the line between this world and the world of the divine was very thin, and it could be broken at any time. And you could be riding a donkey, and all of a sudden, God would speak through the donkey. Or you could be looking at a bush, and all of a sudden, you're hearing God's voice, right? Or you could be out in the desert by yourself with your child, and all of a sudden, a man appears and knows your name and knows what's going on with you, and that's a divine messenger. So that's the world as they experienced it. And I don't know if those things ever literally happened, but I know that that's how the people who wrote those stories understood the world and experienced it. And this very hyper-literal way we read Torah and get very entangled with it is so, I think, completely unknown to our ancestors. The traditional Jewish way to read Torah is through 2,000 years of history, which is 2,000 lenses. It's that far, and it's through all that. And those 2,000 years are other people taking Hebrew Bible very personally and then adding their personal experience to it and using metaphor to do that. So I really believe when we enter into these metaphors, to me, I feel like I'm connecting to something very ancient and much closer to the sacred, which to me is very powerful. And the last thing I want to say, metaphors are not definitions. I'm not saying God is a rock. I'm not saying God is a cloud. I'm saying when I take those metaphors seriously, they help me understand something about the divine and the experience of the sacred. I believe this is provable scientifically, that all humans in all times and all places have had experiences of the sacred, and just different cultures express it differently, and I have access to our culture. So again, metaphor is not as if. It's just the way our brains work. It's the way our minds grasp reality. So my invitation as I read is to really enter into the metaphor and see what happens. So that's my preface. So good. All right, so let me read. I'm going to read the chapter that really has the most to do with Sinai. And it's the metaphor of God as kol, the Hebrew word kol, which means voice. All right. And if anyone at home is reading along, I'm going to start at page 95. All right. Let's see. So this chapter is called If You Truly Listen. In the spring of 1979, I attended an Elvis Costello concert in Washington, D.C., one of the most religious experiences of my then young life. I was a junior in high school, and Elvis was my god. The concert was amazing. Costello wouldn't play unless everyone was standing up, and so we all were, atop the seats of our chairs for the entire 90 minutes. The music went on without interruption or between song chatter, just one loud, raucous song after another, the audience singing along at the top of our lungs. At one point, I had to go out to the bathroom. When I stepped down from my chair, the sound became an undifferentiated roar. It was an all-encompassing, ecstatic experience, and I can still feel a few of the tremors in my body today, many decades later. Let's jump ahead a little bit. In Jewish tradition, the peak religious experience in the Torah happens when the Israelites, newly freed from slavery in Egypt, arrive at Mount Sinai. There, they experience the mythical equivalent of a full-scale rock concert. So this is from the book of Exodus. Now it was on the third day at daybreak. There were thunder sounds and lightning, a heavy cloud on the mountain, and an exceedingly strong sound of the ram's horn. Now Mount Sinai smoked all over, since God had come down upon it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke of a furnace, and all of the mountain trembled exceedingly. Talk about pyrotechnics. Fire and smoke, thunder and lightning, the loud sound of horns, and in the midst of all this, a singular communication. Now the ram's horn was growing exceedingly stronger. Moses was speaking, and God answered him in a voice. God spoke all these words, saying, What follows is what later came to be called the Ten Commandments. In Jewish tradition, the entire Torah was received that day, both the first 5 books of the Bible and the entire chain of rabbinic tradition, the commentary on those books. For the early rabbis, what happened at Mount Sinai was a spiritual Big Bang, the reverberations of which continue to the present day. While there is a lot of imagery at play in the various biblical depictions of Sinai, what stands out is the experience of sound, in Hebrew, kol. In the Exodus account in chapter 19, this word, kol, repeats 4 times in 3 verses. In the translation I offered above, it appears in English as thunder sounds, sound of the ram's horn, and God's voice. When Moses retells the story of Sinai in the book of Deuteronomy, the word kol features prominently again, appearing 7 times in the space of 6 verses. Those of us who are familiar with the Hebrew Bible may not think much of this emphasis on God's voice, considering it just another aspect of God as big person, the ruler who speaks. After all, God talks quite a bit in the early books of the Bible. But deeper exploration reveals that voice does not necessarily depend on a speaker. The experience of voice, of sound, was a fundamental way that our ancestors experienced the divine, sometimes with words and sometimes not. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. This is called Seeing the Sounds. In his book, How to Be Heard, Secrets for Powerful Listening and Speaking, sound expert Julian Treasure notes that, quote, the human body is 70% water, which makes us rather good conductors of sound. It's not surprising, then, that sound can powerfully affect us physiologically, changing our heart rate, breathing, hormone secretions, and even our brain waves. All our bodily rhythms can be affected by sound, end quote. Perhaps the divine kol of the early chapters of Genesis reflects this foundational effect of sound waves upon us. We humans are conductors of the godly voice. Sound is foundational to human experience, whether or not we have the physical ability to hear. In the words of Evelyn Glennie, a virtuoso percussionist who is profoundly deaf, quote, hearing is basically a specialized form of touch. Sound is simply vibrating air which the ear picks up and converts to electrical signals, which are then interpreted by the brain. The sense of hearing is not the only sense that can do this. Touch can do this too. For some reason, we tend to make a distinction between hearing a sound and feeling a vibration. In reality, they are the same thing, end quote. My colleague, Rabbi Darby Lee, who is also profoundly deaf, connects this insight to the verse in the book of Exodus immediately following God's instructions to the Israelites. Quote, all of the people saw the voices, the kolot, and the lightning, and the sound, the kol of the ram's horn, and the mountain smoking. What does it mean to say that the people saw the voices? The Torah seems to be conveying an experience of sound that goes beyond our usual sense of hearing. In our conversation about this text, Darby told me that as a deaf person, he can see himself present at Sinai because everyone saw the voices. Given his experience of needing to see a person when they speak, whether he is reading their lips or watching them as they sign, seeing and listening are intimately connected. Darby says that he would translate kol as vibration. In our conversation, we connected this translation to contemporary physics and string theory, the idea that everything in the universe is vibrating. Darby told me, we are saturated by these vibrational waves. God is the vibration that saturates the universe, end quote. When we understand God through the metaphor of voice, we are giving expression to a foundational experience of something moving through us, something that both shapes who we are and allows us to express ourselves. Voice is about communication and connection, what we put out into the universe and what we take in. I'm going to do one little last piece about voice. In a wonderful rabbinic commentary on God speaking at Sinai, the early rabbis taught that every Israelite received the divine voice, quote, according to their strength. Whatever their age or gender or experience, each person received the voice according to their personal ability or capacity. This teaching suggests that the voice at Sinai could have overwhelmed those who experienced it, yet this did not happen. Each person was able to channel what they needed to receive in such a way that the voice became life-sustaining instead of life-threatening. I love this image of that which was spoken at Sinai, spiritual teachings, instructions for living, cosmic revelation, being heard in hundreds of thousands of unique ways. Each person present received what they needed to hear in that moment. By implication, those of us who continue to listen for the voice similarly receive it according to our strength. Too often we are told that religion means uniformity of thought and practice, that God's word is eternal, unchanging, and uncompromisingly rigid. Yet this rabbinic tradition makes clear that speaking and listening is an interactive process that depends as much on the listener as the speaker. What we are able to hear depends on how well we listen and on what we need to receive in any particular moment. According to the Hasidic teacher, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vorki, when the Torah says that the Israelites saw the voices at Sinai, this means that they saw and realized that one must take the voice into oneself and make it one's own. When I was 30 years old, I entered rabbinical school. A question I've heard a lot in the intervening years is, what made you decide to become a rabbi? My answer is usually, I don't know. Becoming a rabbi wasn't something I thought about as a young person, which when being female would have disqualified me in any case. And I didn't arrive at the decision by any well-thought-out logical process or in a mystical moment of a call. As I've told my story over the years, I've come to realize that this particular decision was the result of an accumulation of moments of hearing many different voices. These moments included a friend of the family wondering about my administrative job at a nonprofit when I was in my late 20s, surprised because she thought I wasn't good at what I was doing. I actually was, but what she meant was, you're a creative person who used to write musicals in high school. What happened to all that? A man selling me something in a Jewish crafts fair who asked me if I went to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. I answered, not yet. Performing a few Jewish songs at a national gathering of community organizers, after which one of the women told me that I had a gift, which I took to mean that if I had a gift, I had a responsibility to use it for the greater good in some way. Listening to a speech by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. on my car radio one day, and realizing that if I was going to do social justice work, then this was the language I wanted to be using, a language grounded in moral vision and God's Spirit. All of these moments, and probably many more, ultimately coalesced into my decision to explore a career in the rabbinate. The decision that would shape my adult life was the result of a process of discernment that I didn't even realize I was engaged in, an ongoing process of listening. I want to share one other little bit and then open it up for some questions. So the other, there's a bunch of metaphors at Sinai, but another one is God as cloud. So I wanted to share a little bit from the cloud chapter. This is one of the ones I wrote most recently, as you'll hear. In the early months of 2020, I was on sabbatical, taking a few months off from my congregational work to focus on writing this book. I returned on March 10th, just in time for the Jewish holiday of Purim and the big Purim party. 5 days later, the congregation, along with much of Massachusetts, was physically shut down due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Those first few weeks brought many challenges and a lot of learning. I had to figure out how to lead Shabbat services via Zoom, how to guide and comfort congregants unable to be physically present with their ill and dying parents, how to create B'nai Mitzvah ceremonies with me in one place and the family in another. The question that accompanied me in all of my work with my congregation was this: how do we foster a sense of closeness to one another, to our community, to Jewish practice, when we can't be physically close? That spring, as I taught a Zoom class about God as metaphor, or God in metaphor, I realized that this same question was very much alive for my biblical ancestors. They seemed to have experienced Yud-Heh Vav-Heh as a presence that could be closely felt, yet could not be held in a material object, in an idol made, not in an idol made of metal or wood or clay. The divine could be glimpsed, but not fully seen, heard, but not entirely comprehended, encountered, but not contained. With the metaphor of cloud, the biblical authors found a way to convey a sense of nearness to something close by that cannot be touched. During a family vacation in Puerto Rico, Gina and I took our kids for a hike in El Yunque National Forest, a tropical rainforest in the Luquillo Mountains. It is a beautiful area, sacred to the indigenous Taino people. We climbed up the El Yunque peak, and arriving at the top, felt disappointed when we couldn't see anything at all. The view was completely obscured by clouds as we sat and rested on the rocks. We were about to give up and head back when, all of a sudden, the clouds swept away, and we found ourselves gazing at a magnificent panorama. A few minutes later, the clouds returned, and we could barely see a foot in front of us. Dense fog, and then a view, fog, and then view. This magical oscillation continued as we sat within the cloud. It is in the nature of clouds to obscure things from view while also making something that is usually invisible, visible. As the folks at Nassau explain, water vapor is always in the sky in some amount, but is invisible. Clouds form when an area of air becomes cooler until the water vapor there condenses to liquid form. At that point, the air is said to be saturated with water vapor. The air where the cloud forms must be cool enough for the water vapor to condense. The water will condense around things like dust, ice, or sea salt. The temperature, wind, and other conditions where a cloud forms determine what type of cloud it will be. The authors of the Bible most likely did not know all of the science behind the formation of clouds, but they understood an aspect of reality that this scientific definition of clouds makes clear: that something life-sustaining and ever-present, whether water vapor or the divine, can be both unseen and very much there. Indeed, it is when the water vapor in the atmosphere both cools down and interacts with other objects in the atmosphere, dust, ice, salt, that it becomes visible as a cloud. So too, the biblical text about God as cloud imply that Yud-Heh Vav-Heh's invisible presence becomes visible when it interacts with human beings. So I look at a bunch of examples. Often God's presence, both to Moses and to the people and to others, is as a cloud or in a cloud. I just want to read a little bit about the cloud at Sinai. While the divine cloud expresses a sense of God's presence, there are times when the appearance of the cloud is more foreboding than reassuring. One of those times was at Mount Sinai, as the Israelites awaited the great revelation. The experience of thunder and lightning and loud sounds frightened the people, and they stood at a distance, but, quote, Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. The thick God cloud on Sinai is not like the reassuring column of cloud that accompanied the Israelites on their journey. Yet Moses is undeterred. He walks right into the dark, dense cloud. The 18th century Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, understood this scene as a teaching about the obstacles we encounter on the spiritual path. So this is Rabbi Nachman. The obstacle is like a thick cloud. This is the meaning of the verse, so the people stood at a distance. When they see the thick cloud, namely the obstacle, they remain at a distance. But Moses, who represents the quality of awareness for all of Israel, approached the thick cloud where God was. Namely, he approached the obstacle where the blessed God is actually hidden. For Rabbi Nachman, the Israelites represent a normal state of consciousness, that is, most of us on most days. In the presence of something that appears to us to be an obstacle, the natural tendency is to back away. Moses, however, represents the quality of awareness, a different kind of understanding. Moses realizes that what appears to others as daunting or difficult contains God's presence, and so he goes towards it. And then a little more Rabbi Nachman. One who is aware can find God in the midst of the obstacles themselves. There really are not any obstacles in the world at all, because in the obstacles themselves is found the Holy One. Through the obstacles themselves, in fact, one might draw closer to God, because that is where God is hidden. And this is the meaning of Moses approached the thick cloud. That is the obstacle, for that is where God was. Commenting on this teaching, Rabbi Sheila Peltz Weinberg writes, when we get into an adversarial relationship with our own experience, we notice that the unpleasantness of the experience is exacerbated. It's like picking a scab. Awareness is restricted. The practice of mindfulness is the alternative strategy pointing to in the Rabbi Nachman text. We can choose to enter the frightening or difficult experience. We can choose to draw near, not to run away, and to resist the mental habits. Moses represents the quality of mindfulness, which is non-judgmental awareness moment to moment. There is no pushing away and no holding back. Rabbi Nachman's invitation to us is to realize that godliness is present in both sides of clouds. I quoted Joni Mitchell earlier, the pleasant and the difficult. What first appears as an obstacle can become an opportunity for awareness and connection. As Rabbi Weinberg teaches, mindfulness practice is a powerful tool to foster the capacity to sit with what is, to come close to our experience with a calm, loving awareness. So I'm going to stop there, I think. So for folks who haven't read the book, each chapter I go into the metaphor and sort of talk about what aspect of godliness I find in it, and then there are practices, because the metaphors can't just like live on the page. They're not just things to read, they're things to experience. So there's meditations and singing, and for example, in the chapter on voice, there's a talking practice called Hidbotedut. There's a listening practice to see what the world is saying to us every day. There's a practice of silence and the practice of song. And similarly, some different practices for cloud and fire, etc. I think I will pause. So, Mark, were you able to unmute Zoomers? So if anyone from Zoom has a question or thought, you can raise your hand and I'll let, and I'm not sure I'll be able to see it. I'm just looking, I want to look at, that's not what I want. Where am I? I can't see, the chat. I want to see the chat is what I want to see. Cool. Or you can put things in the chat, and we'll see it there. Or Melissa will unmute you. And if there are folks here, I'm going to give you the microphone so people on Zoom can hear you. Does anyone just have a thought, reaction, question? If it's from a different part of the book that you already read, that's fine too. And again, folks on Zoom, if you want to either unmute and ask a question or put something in the chat. Everyone here is in stunned silence. I don't know. Yes, Dan.
And this is only to break the silence and
Thank you.
Prime the
Dan,
pump.
for jumping in.
I was struck with what you said about the process of speaking and listening.
Yeah.
And that communication isn't complete until the listener has heard something. And three people listening to the same person speaking may actually hear three different things. I'm trying to tie that back to God, which I'm not succeeding in right now, but there's an important life lesson in there, which is what we say is not necessarily what the other person hears. In fact, more often than not, they hear something a bit different. Sometimes they hear something very different, and that's important to remember.
Yeah, I think the connection to the God part, Dan, is that listening is a very profound practice in Judaism, right? I mean, I talk in the chapter, there's a lot more in that chapter, but I talk about the Shema. I mean, and I was studying the part of Deuteronomy that includes the Shema the other day with one of our upcoming Benot Mitzvah, and they kept the Eitz Chaim kept translating listen as obey, and it just made me so frustrated. It doesn't say obey, it says listen. Listen is not obeying, listening is listening. So we talked about that, and she and I talked about it, but so 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 the burden is not so much of us on speakers, but as listeners, and to see listening as work, and the divine messages don't get to us, like with clear captions. So there is real work in it. Would you hand the mic to Ernest behind you?
I have another idea about how it's connected to
Yes,
the
please,
divine.
please.
What I heard in that is that every person, for example, on Sinai, heard the voice, and what you shared emphasizes that everyone heard it in their own way, and that understanding is just as valuable as the written Torah. And for me, that speaks to an insistence in Judaism on every single person who engages with Torah's understanding that is Torah that's just as valuable as the text. And I feel like so many times learners can devalue their own learnings or ideas that come from Torah study, and that this type of listening lifts up all of our interpretations.
Thank you, Ernest. Yeah, and I think, and then to come back to the metaphor, it's the voice speaking through us, right? So that voice at Sinai continues to speak as we wrestle. There's a beautiful midrash that, what was given at Sinai was every question that every student will ever ask, about Torah. That's, forever. So that, and it says questions also, which is interesting. It doesn't say answers given. So it's beautiful, and that's how the voice continues speaking. I'm going to look in the, thank you for putting in I'm not able to hear folks on Zoom. Moshe, hello, Moshe Giventhal. I would love to do one of the exercises you have with a metaphor, because I'm not sure what to do practically to do with the voice and cloud metaphors you described. So let me give you an example of a voice practice. Thank you, Moshe, for that question. So if you've got the book, it's on page 116. So I call this the wagon driver practice. There's a wonderful story told about another 18th century Hasidic rabbi, Moshe Leib of Sasov. While walking along the road one day, he was asked by a wagon driver to pick up something that had fallen from the wagon. When Rabbi Moshe Leib responded that he wasn't able to, the wagon driver replied, "You're able to, you just don't want to." In this moment, Moshe Leib heard the word of God speaking directly to him. You are able to, you just don't want to. And so that's the story. I love the idea that an esteemed rabbi would hear, in the rebuke of a somewhat obnoxious wagon driver, a personal message from God. A later rabbi commented on this story, "Whatever transpires during the course of our lives, whatever we see or hear, is all the voice of God speaking to us. We must always be listening to hear God's voice speaking to us. In experiencing the divine as voice, we can attune ourselves to what the world is telling us in even the most mundane interactions." So this is the practice. Choose a day and set an intention to be listening all day long as if God/voice/the universe is communicating directly with you. What do you need to hear today? What messages do you receive? You might pay attention to actions you do every day or to interactions with other people. What do you learn about yourself when you pay attention in this way? What do others have to teach you? This listening practice is different from having an opinion about things you observe. Instead of your habitual reactions, try to bring an element of surprise to what you encounter. Be brave like Rabbi Moshe Leib, and see if you can find the divine message intended just for you in a challenging situation. This can be a great opportunity to turn a situation that might lead to defensiveness or anger into a learning moment. Just do it gently and with a sense of humor if possible. So that's one practice. Another voice practice is hitbodedut, which is setting a certain amount of time and just speaking as if God is listening, whether or not you believe that. It's very powerful, just hearing the sounds of our own voice. Thank you for that question. Or it asks, so if God on Sinai had spoken, but the Israelites hadn't heard, either actually or metaphorically, would God have spoken? I.e., is there God if there are no people listening? I'm going to reframe that question, Aura. That metaphor assumes that all we can say about the sacred is our experience of it. So the Torah is not a history book. It doesn't pretend to be. Actually, the people who wrote it didn't know what a history book was. They were trying to convey an experience. So they were conveying an experience of a group of people receiving a message. Why they wrote that story, I do not know. So I guess again, so I think the whole metaphor frame gets us out of does God exist or not into how do we access a universal human experience that every people everywhere has experienced, and what does this particular metaphor give to us? And each metaphor, we need a lot of metaphors because any particular metaphor lifts up different aspects of the experience. And when we're stuck with just the big person metaphor, which is not always a bad metaphor, but when we're stuck with that metaphor, questions come up that it can't answer, and then theologians I think, waste a lot of time actually trying to answer those questions when another metaphor might speak to it differently. So the voice metaphor speaks to this sense of how is the universe speaking to me and what am I learning? The cloud metaphor speaks to impermanence, speaks to obstacles, speaks to other aspects of our experience. So that's how I would answer that. Sorry, I just lost Lisa's comment. And then we'll go back to, where's the chat? Lisa Schneier says, one aspect of the metaphors that interests me is how different they are, like water and rock, and how that makes sense based on what humans need at different moments. Yes, thank you, Lisa. That's really it. We need this, I use the metaphor of a menu, like we need this menu of metaphors because sometimes our hearts are breaking and we need a metaphor that speaks to that. Sometimes we're seeking wisdom and we need a metaphor that speaks to that. Sometimes we're terrified and we need refuge and we need a metaphor that speaks to that. And experiences of the divine, experiences of God have spoken to every human experience, over time. And the metaphors I found here, like, there weren't very many experiences I could think of that weren't spoken to by most of these metaphors. Anybody else here? Yeah, Debbie, would you grab the mic? Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm going to be able to say this, but I'm going to try. So God becomes a construction.
Put it a little closer to you.
Yeah, so God becomes, in this sort of framework, a construction of the human mind.
No. God does not become a construction of the human mind. The human mind approaches this experience through metaphor.
But the experience is a human experience. There is no sort of what is it that is experienced except for humans seeking a spiritual experience which they construct in different ways.
I wouldn't say construct. So let me give you the example of time. Would you agree that time exists?
Yes.
Outside of humans, okay,
Yeah.
time exists. We can represent time mathematically. Humans don't experience time mathematically. We experience time through metaphor. One very dominant metaphor in our experience is time as a precious resource. Time is money. This is since the Industrial Revolution. We don't just talk about time this way, we experience it that way, right? We're in the doctor's office, we are wasting our time. We save time, we budget time, we spend time. Time exists. We can only get through it through metaphor. Sometimes we experience time as a flow, as movement. We're moving towards something, we're moving away from something in the past. In that metaphor, it's endless in both directions. It's not limited at all. So now there are other things that we use metaphor for, like love. Is that limited to humans? I don't know, because I don't know exactly what animals experience. Love can only be described through metaphor. It can only be accessed through metaphor. You could try to describe what happens in your body, but that's very thin. So I'm going to suggest that God exists, whatever that means. We can only access it through metaphors. That's all I can really say about it, which is different than saying it's a construct of the human mind.
I think as a psychologist, I come at this as a psychologist.
Yeah.
And psychologists talk about constructivist approaches
Right.
to understanding the human mind. In other words, a developing child, if you read Piaget, interacts with reality,
Just closer to your mic.
interacts with reality and constructs a version of reality in its head through experience, constructs. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is, I don't know that time is a good,
Right. I think cognitive linguists aren't psychologists. They're
No,
making a different claim. That's all I'm saying. So I'm not basing it in psychology. I'm basing it in cognitive linguistics, which is just a different frame, and it would suggest that this is how we perceive reality. It's not about constructing reality. It's actually about how we perceive and experience reality. So I can't speak to the psychological.
I think that is psychology. That is cognitive psychology. But
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand, with relation to the God thing,
Right.
are we positing that there is a God? Or are we positing that humans have a need that they construct a God to fulfill,
Yeah,
to,
that's
that
what's-
they construct a God to fulfill some kind of a drive that they have to
Right.
make sense of the world?
I just think that question comes like from Freud, who didn't believe any of it. I mean that, and I'm just suggesting a different frame. I'm suggesting that there's an experience that is so foundational to being human. There's a book by a anthropologist, Barbara King, that I quote, who sees the experience of the sacred as a fundamental aspect of the human brain and human imagination and human experience. So it is fundamental. To be honest, I mean, what it means to be out there or in there, I don't know what that means. I mean, it shapes our reality. We don't know what created the universe. We don't know how the universe works. The universe is probably beyond anything any of us can imagine. So I just feel like that whole train of Western philosophy is just sort of unfortunate, because I think it got us, no, I don't really mean that. Like, it got us off on these questions of existing, non-existing, instead of like, here's this foundational human experience. Who wouldn't want to like access it? Who wouldn't want to be able to, you know, be part of that? It's, you know, and it's powerful. I don't know, is love just a construct of the human brain? People die for love, literally die, right? Will sacrifice themselves for others. That's pretty powerful, whatever that is. I think God is the same. So the outside inside is just less interesting to me, but I do think it's a foundational human experience. I do not know how the rest of creation experiences the divine, so I can't speak to it, but you know, so I don't know if that's helpful. I mean, I understand your question. I just think it's coming from a place I'm just trying to answer a different question, I think. Yeah, Sue, will you take the thing? This is Sue
I
speaking.
guess it made me think, and I think it was what Rabbi Toba that you had already said, which is that so many cultures, human cultures, have come to some form of sacred, whether it's God or not God, or comparable stories that cross cultures that have slightly different bases. And maybe we could even look at what might be cave drawings or anything that humans have been trying to reach and understand all this. So anyway, it just seemed, based
Yeah.
on what you said, that maybe that comes to where that fundamental piece.
Let me read a little bit, actually, that answers this, what you've raised. Deb, I don't mean to demean what you've said at all, but it's important. It's hard because I think we're so trained to think as Western sort of rational people. And I'm going to quote something from this Barbara King. So this is called The Religious Imagination, page 22. When we talk about God today, we are referring to a set of metaphors that our ancestors began to develop thousands of years ago as they observed their world and formulated truths about it. Human experience of the sacred, that is, a sense of connection to something beyond our immediate mundane lives, and a desire to interact with that something, seems to be as old as humanity itself. We see evidence of early human sense of spirits or powers beyond this world in remains of burial rituals from as far back as 90,000 years ago, in cave art from 30,000 years ago, and in the remains of a temple in Turkey from 11,000 years ago. Anthropologist Barbara J. King has suggested that religion evolved in our prehistory as an expression of a fundamental trait she calls belongingness. I don't think she's Jewish or a Reconstructionist, but I love that she calls this belongingness, which she describes as, quote, a useful shorthand for the undeniable reality that humans of all ages and all societies thrive in relation to others. She goes on to say, quote, I believe that the desire for emotional connection with the sacred is fundamental to our species. The religious imagination thrives on the human yearning to enter into emotional experience with some force vaster than ourselves. The human religious imagination developed in ever-widening circles of engagement, from immediate social companions to members of a larger group, then across groups, and eventually to a wholly other dimension, the realm of sacred beings, end quote. King's use of the term religious imagination might imply that religious experience is at base imaginary in the sense of not real, but that is not what King is suggesting. Rather, the ability to imagine something beyond ourselves is a highly developed aspect of our brains, which, like conceptual metaphor, is grounded in very real human experience. Critics of religion often make the argument that once upon a time, human beings were unaware of how the world really worked, and saw in natural phenomenon like earthquakes, floods, and bounteous harvests the hand of supernatural beings. So the argument goes, once we have science to explain these things, religion becomes irrelevant and irrational. But while it may be true that a part of the religious impulse arose from an attempt to understand natural phenomenon, humanity's engagement with the sacred has always been about much more than just explaining things. Our religious and spiritual tendencies are about engaging with all of life, which for large segments of humanity over the millennia has meant engagement with beings or forces, God, gods, or spirits that lie beyond the human realm. In some cultures, it has included an awareness that all living beings are infused with a sacred life force that must be acknowledged and honored. In others, it has meant shaping one's life in line with a flow or way to foster inner qualities like patience, strength, and wisdom. In yet others, it has meant fostering a sense of wonder and awe at the workings of the universe, as well as achieving just and loving relationships among human beings. So I go on to say, like, I really don't care if you don't use the word God. Like, it's not, I think it's very hard for us in the West, almost impossible to use the word God and not be inside the metaphor of a big person, you know? So when we say, does it exist, that's really what we're talking about. So one reason I offer the metaphors is just to get out of that. And if people are like, well, that's not really God, it's like, whatever, call it, like, I'm so not attached to that word, you know, which is, I mean, even though it's on the title because the publisher said people Google things, so you have to have God in the title, so it is. But that's why I love Yud Hey Vav Hey. It's like such a gift to us as Jews that we have this name that you can't say, you can't represent. It's this invitation to metaphor. So, God is not a Hebrew word. So, and I think when most people see those four letters, Yud Hey Vav Hey, hopefully they don't go immediately to a person. It's a signal that there's something else that we're talking about. So I want to wrap up. Did anyone else on Zoom want to put a question or anything in the chat? Or anyone else in the room? Dan, yeah. So this is Dan Rome speaking.
So this is just to tie back maybe to my opening comment about what you hear. So a volcano erupts, and you hear an explanation that has to do with molten lava deep in the earth, and pressure and fissures, and a release of pressure and hot magma, and that can be all you need to hear. Or you can hear something more.
Yes, yeah. We're going to read something from Paul here. Paul had us, in your God is Cloud chapter, you have one section, God is cloud by day and is fire by night. There's one way of thinking about that is there are times when we see clearest by obscuring something that seems obvious. And other times we need light to see something that we would not otherwise observe. It would escape us, but for the fire interrupting the darkness. Both are perhaps important in order to experience the world to the fullest. Perhaps the God concept helps us do that. Oh my, that's beautiful, Paul. Thank you. Yes, Louise, yeah.
I was very moved by your description of the cloud and Moses going into the cloud, and it makes me think about all the awful, painful, dark, murky, horrible things that are going on right now, and how we, on some level, we're pained by it, we're disgusted by it, we're repulsed by it. We want to sometimes just keep it away. And I was thinking as you were talking about somehow going into it, and being with it and being in it, and that I could conceive of something positive coming out of that somehow, of seeing it in a different way, or of seeing your connection to those things in a different way that would bring you to a different place somehow than all those awful other feelings I just described.
Yes, that is the hope. All right, I think I'm going to wrap up. Last one. All right, Emmy, yes. You get the last word here. And Emmy came to my first book talk. I'm impressed, Emmy. Emmy and Lisa read the first one.
So I haven't, I don't know the original quote in Hebrew or anything, but linking back to the voice stuff, I just thought it was I studied Japanese a lot in high school, and they have a lot of different words to mean one thing. Like there are like 3 or 4 different words for love. But the use of one word for like 6 different sounds, including God's voice, to me was very interesting, as in like how they saw like the sound of the eruption, the sound of thunder was all like the same as God's voice. And I thought that was really interesting, like to see it from that perspective, I guess.
That's beautiful. That right, there is something that is voice, capital V, that runs through all of those, even though they're quite different. All right, I'm going to wrap up because we have other wonderful things this evening. So I'm not going anywhere. The book is not going anywhere. Well, hopefully it's going out in the world, but it's not leaving us. So yeah, I've been working so hard. I've been studying this book with you, and I think the questions people are raising, about. I'm really asking people to think about this in a really different way, and it only works if we do it. So I hope in this coming year, I'm hoping folks will read the book. It's pretty readable, I think you've heard. It's pretty readable. And then I hope both individually and collectively we can play with some of these metaphors and just see what would it be like? Because you really, what I say in the book, at the very end of the book, I say, now that you finish the book, you can go back and start it again. You need to spend time. It's a book with the practices. If you read it without the practices, it actually doesn't really make any sense. It's not meant to be an intellectual treatise. It's meant to be an invitation to practice. And that a metaphor might speak to you today and not speak to you tomorrow, or the metaphor you really don't like is maybe the one you really should engage with because it's there to teach you something. So I hope collectively we can start to engage with these metaphors and be creative with them. So stay tuned. I don't know what form that will take, but I really, and I thank Congregation Dorshate Tzedek in the acknowledgments, because it was really studying it with you all that made me realize it works. This really works, and that's what I care about. Ultimately, that's where the Reconstructionist part of me is very practical. I can't make any definitive statements about the nature of reality, but in a world that's exactly what you just said, Louise, is difficult and challenging personally, politically, in every way, we desperately need these practices, and we need, I think, to know that we're not alone, and we need to know that we're not doing this all by ourselves. And whatever that means, you can interpret that however you mean, and to me the metaphors are a way into that. So thanks everybody so much for... I felt a little bad. I was doing all these book talks everywhere, and I hadn't done one at Dorshay's. Now I have. So for folks on Zoom, we're going to do a Havdalah, and then after Havdalah, wrap up on the Zoom, and then we'll have some more in-person things that I hope folks will stay for. So I need a few helpers up here to hold the wine and the candle. Anybody want to come up? Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Jenny. Awesome. So I'm going to, come on up, Jenny. I'm going to let you hold that. I'm just going to, and Rob, there's Havdalah sheets right there if you want to hand them out to folks. And if you would just hold this over here, that'd be great. And block the, oh yeah, and handouts, we have some spices. So the one change on the sheet is that we're not going from Kodesh L'chol, we're not going from holy to regular, we're going from holy to holy. So after we do Havdalah, we're going to light those candles with that. Okay. So if people are able to rise in body, or you can rise in spirit, we're going to do Havdalah. Yai dai yai dai 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 yai dai yai dai 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 yai dai yai dai 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 yai dai yai dai 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 yai dai yai dai 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 yai dai yai dai 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ruach haolam hamavdil bein kodesh lechodesh bein or lechoshech bein yom hashvi'i l'sheshet yemei ha'aseh Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil bein kodesh lakodesh. And we're going to say the brachot for Shavuot. So we're going to light a Yizkor candle. I think. Does that work? There you go. Light the Yizkor candle, and then you can use maybe just use matches for that. Yeah, well, maybe. Yeah. And you're gonna just take a little sip of this. We'll light the Yizkor candle in memory of all those we're remembering. Thank you, Jenny. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel yom tov. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehecheanu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Chag Sameach, everyone. So before we split, let me tell you what's going to happen. Where did the microphone go? So I'm going to say goodnight to the Zoomers. If you guys want to come join us, we're here. If not, see you later. Chag Sameach. I'm going to ask the folks leading our workshops to say a quick word about it. Where did the, there we go. So I'm going to ask.